It's 11:47 at night. The argument began over something small, a forgotten call, a sharp tone, a question answered too defensively. But somewhere along the way, the subject disappeared. Now, two people who once knew exactly how to comfort each other are standing in a kitchen, trying to be understood, while their nervous systems are preparing for battle. And then he says something he has never said before. Not because he planned to, because he's exhausted, cornered, desperate to make her understand what this moment is doing to him. For a few seconds, there's silence. Maybe the argument even ends. But 3 months later, those words return. That is the strange danger of conflict. We often reveal our most sensitive truths at precisely the moment when the other person is least capable of receiving them carefully. There are 10 things a man should be extremely cautious about admitting during a heated argument. Not because vulnerability is weakness, and not because women inevitably weaponize what men reveal, but because emotionally flooded people of either sex can turn intimate information into ammunition. And the first is perhaps the most misunderstood. Imagine a man finally saying, "I'm afraid you're going to leave me." On the surface, it sounds honest, and it is. But honesty and timing are not the same thing. Relationship researchers, such as John Gottman, have described how intense conflict can produce physiological flooding, a state in which heart rate rises, attention narrows, and constructive listening becomes much harder. When the nervous system begins interpreting conversation as threat, people stop hearing only meaning. They start detecting leverage, danger, rejection, and weakness. That changes what happens to a confession. "I'm afraid you'll leave me," may actually mean, "You matter enough to me that losing you would hurt." But during a hostile argument, it can be heard as, "He believes I have the power to abandon him." And once a fear has entered the battlefield, it can become attached to future conflicts. A threat like, "Maybe I should just leave," suddenly carries far more psychological force, because the other person now knows exactly where the wound is. This does not mean a man should hide abandonment fears from his partner. Quite the opposite. Secure intimacy requires revealing what frightens us, but vulnerability needs the right environment. A quiet conversation the next morning allows fear to become intimacy. The same confession shouted at midnight may become part of the conflict itself. That distinction matters far beyond relationships. Emotional intelligence is not merely knowing what you feel. It is knowing when, where, and with whom a feeling can be expressed without being distorted by the moment. And the next admission is even more dangerous because it can quietly change the balance of respect inside a relationship. The argument has moved from what happened to who he is. Listen, you don't understand me. You always make everything harder. And after 20 minutes of defending himself, he finally stops. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm just not good enough for you." That is the second thing to avoid admitting in the heat of conflict, a global judgment about your own worth. Psychology has long distinguished between guilt and shame. Guilt says, "I did something wrong." Shame says, "There is something wrong with me." That difference is enormous. A man can take responsibility for being distant, impatient, careless, or insensitive without turning a behavior into an identity. "I handled that badly," leaves room for repair. "I'm a terrible husband," does something else. It invites the argument to become a trial of his entire character. And once those absolute statements enter a relationship, they can become strangely durable. Months later, during another disagreement, the sentence may return. "You said it yourself. You're not good enough for me." The third dangerous admission is closely related. "I need you more than you need me." There may be moments when this feels completely true, but spoken during conflict, it transforms affection into a statement about power. Healthy relationships contain dependence. Attachment research makes that clear. Adults regulate emotion partly through trusted partners. Needing someone is not inherently unhealthy. The problem is framing that need as an imbalance, because now the argument is no longer simply about connection. One person has implicitly declared that losing the relationship would cost him more. There's a better way to communicate the same emotional truth. This relationship matters deeply to me, and I don't want us hurting each other like this. Same attachment, different psychological message. One communicates helplessness, the other communicates investment without surrendering self-respect. And that distinction becomes critical with the next admission, because some statements don't merely expose insecurity. They reveal exactly how far a man believes he can be pushed. Sometimes the most damaging sentence in an argument sounds almost romantic. I'd forgive you no matter what. That is the fourth admission to avoid during conflict. He may mean loyalty. He may mean, I love you enough to fight for us. But what he has actually communicated is something very different. There may be no behavior severe enough to make me leave. Psychologically healthy relationships need boundaries precisely because love is powerful. A boundary tells another person where connection ends and self-betrayal begins. And boundaries lose meaning when we announce that they have no consequences. The fifth admission sounds even more innocent. I'll do anything to keep this relationship. Again, the problem is not commitment. It is the word anything. Under emotional pressure, people sometimes bargain against themselves. Fear of loss creates urgency, and urgency makes terrible negotiations feel reasonable. A man begins surrendering needs he considered important yesterday, simply to stop the possibility of separation tonight. But there is a difference between compromise and self-erasure. Compromise says, I can change this behavior because I understand how it affects us. Self-erasure says, tell me who I need to become so you won't leave. And then comes the sixth admission, one many men make because they believe it will end the fight. Fine. Everything is my fault. It rarely ends anything. Research on destructive conflict patterns has repeatedly shown that healthy repair requires specific responsibility. Not theatrical surrender, not blanket blame. If he forgot an anniversary, acknowledge it. If he became defensive, own it. If he spoke cruelly, apologize without qualification. But accepting responsibility for everything teaches neither person what actually went wrong. Worse, it can establish a pattern where peace is purchased through one-sided confession. A mature man does not need to win every argument, but neither does he need to convict himself simply to make the courtroom disappear. Because the next category is more subtle. These are admissions that reveal not how much pain a man will tolerate, but exactly where his deepest insecurities live. And once someone knows the location of a wound, even a loving person can strike it in a moment they later regret. There are insecurities a man may carry for decades without naming them. His aging body, his income, his sexual confidence, the suspicion that he has become less desirable, less capable, less important than he once was. Then, during one brutal argument, he points directly at the wound. That is the seventh admission to avoid in heated conflict, revealing a deep insecurity for the first time. I know you don't find me attractive anymore. I know you think I'm a failure. These may be conversations worth having, but not while both people are emotionally flooded, because intimate knowledge has memory. The eighth admission is revealing exactly who you compare yourself to. You probably wish I were more like your ex. Your friend's husband makes more money than I do. Social comparison is deeply human, but naming the comparison can introduce a third person into the psychological structure of the relationship. From that point forward, ordinary interactions with that person may carry meaning they never had before. The ninth admission is more dangerous, confessing something deeply personal from your past simply because you feel pressured to prove your honesty. Childhood humiliation, a previous betrayal, an old failure you have never processed. Vulnerability is not measured by how much private information you surrender under pressure. Real vulnerability requires choice. When disclosure is voluntary and received with empathy, it can deepen intimacy. Under coercive conditions, the same disclosure can leave a person feeling exposed rather than understood. And then there is the 10th admission. I have nobody except you. It may sound like devotion, but beneath it is an enormous burden. Human beings generally function better with multiple sources of connection. Friendship, family, community, meaningful work, not one person carrying the entire weight of belonging. Telling a partner she is important is intimacy. Telling her she is your entire emotional world can quietly transform intimacy into dependency. None of these 10 truths need to remain secret forever. That is the deeper point. A strong relationship is not one where a man reveals nothing. It is one where difficult truths are spoken deliberately, when both people are capable of treating them as information to understand, not weapons to win. Because the real measure of emotional strength is not silence. It is knowing the difference between opening your heart and abandoning its boundaries. The argument eventually ends. The kitchen goes quiet. The adrenaline fades. And by morning, the words that seemed absolutely necessary at midnight can look very different in daylight. That is why emotional restraint should never be confused with emotional suppression. A mature man does not hide everything he fears. He chooses the conditions under which those fears can be understood. He can say, I'm afraid of losing you. He can admit insecurity, loneliness, regret, even dependence. But the deepest truths of a relationship deserve better than being introduced during combat. Perhaps that is the real lesson behind these 10 admissions. Vulnerability is not simply disclosure, it is disclosure with judgment. Knowing what to reveal requires courage. Knowing when to reveal it requires wisdom. And knowing that you can love someone deeply without surrendering your dignity. That may be one of the most important lessons a man learns with age. If this gave you a different way to understand conflict, subscribe. There are conversations about men and relationships that become more important, not less, as we get older.